Hey guys, it's Cory, and I know I don't do a lot of reviews on things, especially terminal tackle, more baits, but I thought this was a little bit worth mentioning. I've used a lot of rods. You know guys, I like to throw a lot of small stuff. I like to throw little micro machines. But one of the problems you have in musky fishing sometimes is finding a good balance between if you actually go to the spinning rod level, down from the giant baits. You want something a little bit of kind of in the median. It's kind of in the gray zone. So like something that's going to throw baits anywhere from like 3/4 of an ounce to maybe up to 1.5 ounces, but like something that requires a little bit more of the heft of a bait caster and not so much the spinning rod. Gives you a little bit more control, a little bit more on the cast, and you know, bait casters give you a little bit more mid-flight control too. I've tried a lot of rods. It's hard to find one that's really, really perfect. I mean, I've had some decent ones over the years. Fenwick used to make a really good one. But I know Vexan, which is the company that kind of teams up with Tackle Industries, not too long ago they got the bright idea to start incorporating these Revo seats. Used to be the thing you would put onto the handle of a reel. You have to attach it. I wasn't a big fan of that because it was kind of cumbersome, but since they like integrated it into the design of the reel itself, you can take it off. I like that a lot. So they've been doing that with a couple of their models. But the cool thing about this rod is this is actually a musky rod. A lot of times when they drop down to that medium heavy size for musky for throwing like smaller bucktails, little twitch baits, stuff like that, they'll shorten them up a little bit because most guys are just wanting to do little short taps and stuff. That's fine. Usually they come in a 7'6". You don't see many things too much over 8 feet. This one comes in a 9 though. And that's kind of what caught my eye aside from that. So this is a 9-foot medium heavy action musky, and it says rated 1 to 4 ounces. I don't think I'd throw too many things rated 4 ounces on it, but I'll tell you, things down to about 3/4 of an ounce to 1.5 ounces, it's about perfect. And one of the reasons for that is when you're trying to throw this stuff on bass tackle, you can throw bass tackle and get away with it, but you don't have the same control as you do, especially when you come into a figure 8. But like with a bass rod, you know, it's a lot of this. You're doing more stuff with your wrist. Having that extended butt like this, so it's like a bass action rod with this big handle like you'd be used to on another musky rod. You can tuck it in and do little light twitches like you would with a big rod, but it's got a little bit of a softer tip. And even though it's got a soft tip though, it still loads up really well. Like that's one of the things you kind of encounter, like when you're fishing these lighter presentations for fish. You don't want, the spinning rod, the spinning reel will kind of take care of it a little bit because of the way the drag is a little bit much smoother on a spinning reel just by design. But bait casters inherently, there's a little bit of a zzz, 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 even if you set your drag perfect. So it's nice when you have these rods. This has the backbone to throw big things, handle, you know, larger baits. You could throw a 2-3 ounce bait. I'd just probably go on up to a heavy rod for that though. But you can do it. But the nice thing is the way the rod loads throughout. When you get the hook set, you get a really strong initial hook set, but then when you're throwing these baits with a little bit lighter hooks, or not even lighter hooks, just like the thinner, what you want is less just raw force and more just constant force, constant pressure, because you want it to penetrate. And those big hooks, to make them penetrate, constant pressure is great, but you kind of have to like drill them in. With these, it's not too hard to drill in. If you've ever been stuck by one of these, you know how easy it is to get stuck by one of these. It's more about the fact that you just want that constant pressure so it keeps pulling it into it. And it's going to be a little bit easier for them to shake once it's in, and bend. They're easier to bend on a big fish. So having that little bit of a give throughout the rod that also kind of works in conjunction with the drag makes it a really good idea to have one of these when you're fishing these lighter twitch baits that have demand lighter hooks. But the real big thing I like about it out of all of this, other than the grip, and the grip comes in handy, I'll show you another couple presentations I use that more with, is just the fact that it is 9 feet. Because I know, maybe it's just me, I know a lot of guys like really like those shorter rods. I feel like it's almost like phantom limb syndrome when I throw one of those shorter rods. Like you feel like you should be, like if I did this twitch, I wouldn't feel that catch up until it was about here. unless I picked up more slack. But with this, I can leave a little bit more slack and it picks it up a little bit quicker. It hits the tension there. Otherwise, if I did it, I'd probably have to jerk it a little bit further. And it's also, whenever they do that and they make it a little bit longer, it gives more of a length of the rod to kind of create the taper where it has that load up effect, where like it's not just a short whip. You don't want that. You don't want it to be that snappy whippy. You want it to kind of have a little bit of a flex to it so it accommodates the fish when they do head shakes, when they do stuff like that. Something that would cause like little milliseconds of slack on a heavier setup. You want it to kind of accommodate that a little bit. So instead of it just going like this, it'll actually pull the rod throughout the blank. So whenever the fish does shake, you've got tension, and instead of springing back to zero and creating slack, it's just going to kind of go this. So there's still going to be tension. It's going to accommodate that for you. You can kind of see, I mean, I know I just kind of jump all over the rod. You kind of do that after a while when you get used to stuff, and you kind of, like mid-retrieve, I want to keep it higher, move up. The pistol grip thing is kind of neat. A lot of guys will be like, well, I'm trying to use it like this. I don't really think that's the deal. Like, I know that's what they were originally designed for, was jigging for doing this. I don't think that's where it really comes into its best light. It really helps with that sidearm thing if you ever like to do that. It gives you a little bit better of a grip point. Especially when you're palming it though, like right now if I'm twitching it up, just being able to wrap my fingers around something like that, give it a little bit more of a pivot. And most rods have that little trigger. This is way bigger than that little trigger. That little trigger is almost annoying to me at times. But this, you can actually kind of wrap your hand around it. Switch it. You take a rod like this, like right now I'm throwing a juke, and I think it's like a 1 5/8 ounce bait, or 1 15, it's weird. It's a little bit off. It's like 1.5, 2 ounces almost, or 5/16, I don't know. A little bit over an ounce. So it's good for that. And let's talk about a couple other baits it's actually kind of useful for. So especially like these football bass jigs. You can work this on a spinning rod. You can do a lot of these on a spinning rod, and I'm not saying it's a bad idea. I mean, I know I've used the juke in the past on this Musky spinning rod. It works great. But some of these baits like this, you just want a little bit more initial contact power. And I think that's where like having these mid-range bait caster rods really come in handy. Like, so now I'm throwing a bass jig. You can kind of see with this big butt. Like if you're on a bass rod, you just be kind of palming it. This way you can kind of grip that with this. Don't do this. That's stupid. Like I know, but don't do that. But it gives you a little bit better contact point here. You can brace it on your forearm. It's a really good action for that too, because you have the sensitivity. You can kind of feel what it's doing. But it's not too super stiff. And obviously the fact that it's 9 foot really comes in handy when you're doing a figure 8. And if a guy as short as me is saying that, then trust me, having that 9 foot makes a big difference on a figure 8 when you're fishing even the smaller stuff. That's another cool thing too, because you can kind of feel it, like with a jig. You're gonna hit some cover. If you have that stiff rod and you hit it, sometimes you're just already jammed into it. If you have these little tips like this, it'll kind of give you a little bit of initial pressure. Then you can back it off and it's like, okay, and it lets it go. Just taking a sec to fish this back just in case. Nope. So another good application for this, actually I do prefer the lighter bait casting to spinning tackle. I really like the spinning tackle for like super light presentations, little bitty, like really erratic jerk baits. Things you have to make those really sharp, fast movements. Spinning rod's the king of line pickup, so that's a big reason I prefer that for that. But like A lot of these more straight retrieve designs, like a jig or a spinnerbait, I still think the lighter bait casting setup's a little bit more suited to that. Like here's a good example. This is about an ounce spinnerbait. It's made by BJ's Customs. And the reason I like these BJ's Customs ones is for the sheer fact they're relatively cheap. They're built well. They're bass size, but they've got the spin. Like the twist, so you can actually snap onto it. Most bass baits just have that bend. So that's got a twist, you can actually put a snap onto it and it'll stay. But especially when you're doing like this is essentially, you're fishing this pretty similar to the way you just fish a normal bucktail. So it's a straight retrieve, but having this little bit of a lighter action rod, you can pitch it better. You're gonna be able to fling this bait out there. You can even throw the little 1/2 ounce, 3/4 ounce ones on it really well. Oh, sorry. So yeah, that's a really good point about using this too, is like baits where you don't have to pick up as much slack. The bait caster is always going to be hands down probably the winner, because it's just got so much more cranking power. You can control it on the cast a lot better. Might not be able to cast as far. So a straight retrieve bait like a spinnerbait, it's a good candidate for this setup. This is a Tranks 400, but everybody knows that's a good reel. You can kind of see, even if I'm not narrating it, you can kind of see as I'm fishing, like I'll try to change my grip a little bit. Just for what I'm doing in the retrieve, you can kind of move it up and down. But having that little grip there, it gives you a little bit extra leverage, especially you want to set the hook on someone. Especially if you sidearm stuff like that, you can feel the action of that bait, because basically what I'm doing is you kind of give it some slack, you kind of feel how much line you need to have out to get like the perfect pendulum motion, I guess. And then it flings itself, but especially with these lighter baits like this, when you have a little bit more of a flex to the tip, lets you kind of trebuchet it just a little bit better. Whereas with the big rods and big baits, when you do that, just the literal weight of the bait itself is what's going to do it. But this one, even though you're going to leave out a little bit more line, having that little bit of a, whenever you load it up, let's see, that comes in handy when I'm doing that. So I grab that. If I look around, I'm looking for fish. So it's a really good candidate for stuff like this, like these straight retrieve bass-sized baits. Things where you don't really have to deal with line pickup and slack too much. That Revo grip is really nice. One of the other things I'll show you on this, being able to throw smaller topwaters really well. So that's a Whopper Plopper 110. That bait has treated me really well over the years. And I like throwing it on spinning rod because you can just launch it in the next week. With a rod action like this in the combo, I think I've got like 40-pound braid on this. It's kind of nice though, because one of the things about these little baits like this is even though they're small, they've got really stout little hooks for their size, as in thick. And it's kind of nice to be able to like put some heft into it. That might be a fish. So now you've got something that's a small musky sized presentation. It's caught me a lot of big fish. You can throw it a little bit further on the spinning tackle probably, but I will tell you this, there's been times I know that I've lost fish throwing this on spinning tackle simply due to the fact that I couldn't put as much force into driving the hooks in. These are a weird mix. Like you want that constant pressure, but they do require a little bit of penetration power to get them into a musky's mouth a lot of times, especially when they're just doing that nip thing, which they do that a lot. A lot of life in here. Let me get this and I'll show you another thing that these are really good for. Something that a lot of musky guys really relate to in the springtime. And I did it some this spring with this. Lots of guys throw rattle traps. Should probably throw them year round. But they're really popular in the spring. So this rod especially, I know a lot of guys use a little shorter rods. If you want a little bit lighter action tip for these rattle baits, this rod is just about perfect for that, I think. Like, it's allows you to throw them. It's not so stiff that it inhibits the action of the bait. You still get all the advantages of like a full-size musky setup. And like I said, with these straight retrieve things, you're almost always going to be a little bit better with a bait casting setup than you are a spinning rod. Unless it's just so light you can't throw it on a bait caster. Or it's just not logistical. As you can see, especially when you're fishing a bait like this, having that 9-foot tip, 9-foot rod on this setup, it's still a medium heavy, comes in really handy when you're doing a lot of active figure eights. And that's honestly a big reason you don't see a lot of those in the bass. I mean, number one, like not a lot of bass guys really care if the rod's 9 feet or not. But then with the musky stuff, a lot of the guys are throwing the shorter rods. They're throwing the lighter baits, they're making the lighter rods, they're thinking more for twitching and stuff like that. So they don't usually go up past 8 feet. This comes in really handy. Put some speed on it. And you can feel it coming through there. It's still got enough sensitivity you can tell when you tick bottom. You can still feel the bait really well. It's just got a little bit of give to it. You can kind of see me every time instinctively. Like normally I would grab it up here with a lot of presentations where you want to twitch more. But really it's more comfortable when you're just straight retrieving a lot of times. Having that little trigger there, I kind of naturally find myself just kind of falling into place instead of this. And that's a really comfortable position just to have your hand kind of rest on the front of that. Ah, got some stuff. Make one more cast with that. And we'll talk about the little bucktail too. Because that's something most definitely I think this is really suited for. And of all the weird things that I throw, I think a lot of guys can probably relate to that more than anything, especially the guys that fish Wisconsin openers and all those deals, bites, seasonal things. So that's just a single Mepps musky killer. It's a pretty popular bait. Maybe not used a lot, but everybody knows what it is. And I mean, you really can't throw this on a traditional sized musky setup. So you're gonna be usually throwing it on a lighter one. It's probably not gonna be 7'6", maybe 8. But everybody knows, especially with bucktails, you kind of want a little bit of that extra length because you're gonna have to do more figure eights because you don't have much deviation control with the retrieve coming in. So that's when you have to have the fish come in and hit and you turn it here. So especially having this setup like this, where it gives you all the angled and reach so you can do good turns. Still throw this light bait. Those are really underrated baits though. A little bit later we'll do a video with spinning rod, talk about micro machines, and then you get down to some really small spinners. But if you like throwing little bucktails and stuff, this one's a pretty good one to throw whenever you're not seeing a lot of stuff on big things. As you can see, it handles this really well. I need to loosen up the brake a little bit, but and that's only like 3/4 of an ounce. It's not too terrible. I'm really trying to get a fish here on film while we're doing this. The other last one I'll talk about that a rod like this comes in handy with. That's a Salmo sweeper. That's the larger size, and this is a cool little glide bait in that just takes a little bit of action. You don't want a really stiff rod. Even if you have a little short stiff rod, you might have problems throwing this bait a little bit. Just because it's so light. This is a really neat little bait. You can't give it a lot of energy, but those little fins on the back, which I mean, I think a lot of glide baits should integrate more. Like the Hellhound has little things, but I think it would help a lot of glide baits too. Even the ones that, you can tell they use it a little bit, but like the fact these are so accentuated, it really helps keep it level. But this soft tip like this too, it's hard, you have to work at overpowering it. So when you do these little light taps, that's all you want it to do is just go side to side like that with the slack. And that's something you see some guys complain about, because a lot of guys, they look at a glide bait rod. Well, here's a glide bait rod. Glide bait rods usually by definition are like 7 foot, 7'6". And why is that? Because guys, they're doing this. This is how you work a glide bait, right? And if you don't work a glide bait like this, then it's not a glide bait. This is how you work it. But that's not universal. None of these baits have a universal way to work them. And I'll be honest, most of the time when I'm fishing a glide bait and trying to keep it up, I'm usually doing this, twitching it to the side. So you can kind of see, you can do like you can do little light strokes a lot easier when you just do that. And I'm just kind of letting it hit back against my forearm while I just twitch it on that end of it. But trying to work a bait like this, it's just you're already going with gravity and you're just going down. So what happens is as you're working it down, you're having to fight that momentum going down with gravity when you want it to hit and give it slack. So a lot of times you're going to pull it through. So what would happen is when you're fishing a bait like this and trying to jerk it down, even with a short rod, you're going to be pulling it more forward. So it's going to be going more like this, because it's going to be hard to remove that energy when you're pulling up against gravity. But when you're hitting it from the side like this, I'm trying to make that make sense, sorry. But if you can imagine, like a lot of guys that work glide baits like this, once you're going down, it's going to be hard to bring it back up. But the thing is, you want it to have that slack. You don't want it to pull through, unless you want it to, but most of the time you don't. So then it's going to be going like that. So you can make it kind of search. But the thing is, when you're wanting to fish it and just make it stay in one place and walk side to side, even though this is a 9-foot rod, it lets you do that a lot easier because you hit the tension of the line a lot quicker with that extra 1.5 feet. You can do these little light taps like this. Now even then, it's like if I wanted to make this hunt, I would just pull through on this. See how you kind of, hard to explain, but as you fish more, you'll kind of just instinctively do things with your arms and your rod and stuff that'll kind of accommodate what you're wanting to do. But see, when I'm wanting to pull it through more and make it just kind of hunt from side to side, I tucked it in under my arm, hit the butt, and then I can pull it through a little bit and make it kind of go like this. If I'm just wanting it to go like this, the last thing you want is any energy after the initial hit. So you just immediately, as soon as you feel tension, you give it slack. That's hard to do when you're jerking down. When you do this to the side with a 9-foot rod with a soft tip like this and these lighter glide baits, and I guarantee you too, this would work on like a 6-inch Phantom, anything like that. I just happen to really like this glide bait. You can kind of see, like, I just pick up slack as needed, give it a little tap. I got fouled. And then if I want it to hunt a little bit more, I'll tuck it in under my arm so it's got direct contact the whole time, and then I'm literally pulling it forward with my arm. So like you can kind of see, in conclusion, my 5th grade essay, a lot of guys would look at a rod like this and kind of be like, well, it's too specialized, you know. And I mean, I get that a lot of guys like want to own a rod for everything, but a lot of guys can't do that. They don't want to afford to do that. But like if you're talking about owning 2 rods or like just a handful of rods for your own personal use, if you're not trolling, you're not talking about just like the individual actions of things. Like if you just want specialty rods, you can have a big stick, and that's cool. Then the other thing is you really need a rod about like this with this action, but that's the cool thing about this rod that kind of makes it stick out. It's not just the fact that it's got the Revo seat, which comes in really handy, and it's got the perfect balance of action, but the fact that it comes in a 9-foot model in a musky rod format with the giant butt, and you can tuck it in. And plus, this is a really comfortable grip too. It's that wind grip stuff. It makes it kind of sit out a little bit. And they're not too much. I think they're like 180. Don't quote me on that. Maybe just a little bit over 200, but it's a really special little rod. And it's not, I wouldn't even call it a niche thing, because it's very versatile within the bracket of like a certain size spectrum of baits. So like not the super micro machine baits, but like what most guys would call downsizing musky baits. I mean, you just saw us kind of go through the gamut of stuff right there. Like it's hard to find another rod that's like that well suited to that many different things in the downsizing world. So with that being said, I would like to give this my stamp of approval. It's a very, very, very useful tool to have on board your deck. Tight lines.